Imagine a Douglas fir tree so wide that 3 grown men linking arms cannot reach around it. Now imagine that tree has just been cut, and it is lying on the side of a mountain in the rain, somewhere in the forests of Oregon. It weighs more than 20 tons. There are no roads up here, no trucks, no cranes, and somehow a crew of 5 men and 1 steam-powered machine smaller than a garage are about to drag that tree down a mountainside and deliver it to a river landing a mile away. The machine that made this possible was called the steam donkey. It had no wheels. It could not drive anywhere on its own, and yet, for more than 50 years, it was the single most important piece of equipment in the American timber industry. So how did a clunky, smoke-belching winch, invented by a failed gold miner, end up reshaping the forests of the entire American West? Eureka, California, 1853. John Dolbeer had come west from a small farm in Epsom, New Hampshire, 3 years earlier, chasing the same gold rush dream that pulled hundreds of thousands of men to California. He was 23 when he left home, and, like most of them, he did not find gold. What he found instead was timber. Dolbeer landed in the Humboldt Bay area along the northern California coast, where the redwood forests grew so thick and so tall that even the locals had trouble describing them to outsiders. He bought a small sawmill from a man named Martin White and started cutting lumber. The mill burned down. He rebuilt it. It burned down again. Most men would have gone home. Dolbeer borrowed money, rebuilt a second time, and by 1863 he had partnered with a lumber baron named William Carson. Together they formed the Dolbeer and Carson Lumber Company, and within 2 decades it became one of the biggest redwood operations in the state of California. By 1884, the company was producing 15 million board feet of lumber a year from their mill on the Eureka waterfront, but getting the trees out of the forest was still the bottleneck. And in the 1880s, that bottleneck was brutal. Before steam, logging was animal work. Teams of oxen, sometimes 8 or 10 of them yoked together, dragged felled logs along skid roads built from greased wooden ties laid across the forest floor. Building a skid road was back-breaking labor all on its own. Crews had to fell smaller trees, split them into ties, lay them across the path at regular intervals, and then slather the top of each tie with grease or animal fat so the logs could slide over them. A teamster walked alongside the animals, shouting commands, cracking a whip, keeping the whole operation moving at something like a crawl. On flat ground near a river, this worked well enough. The logs slid along the greased skids, the oxen hauled them to the water, and the current carried the timber downstream to the mill. On a good day, a strong team of oxen might move a few dozen logs. But these were not ordinary logs. A single old-growth Douglas fir in the forests of Oregon or Washington could stand more than 250 feet tall, with a trunk 6 or 8 feet across at the base. Some of the coastal redwoods that Dolbeer was working near Eureka were even bigger. Ancient trees more than 1,000 years old, so wide that loggers had to build springboard platforms just to get above the root flare before they could start soaring. The problem was terrain. The best timber in the Pacific Northwest, the massive Douglas fir and old-growth redwood and western red cedar that built the cities of San Francisco and Seattle and Portland, did not grow on flat riverbanks. It grew on ridgelines and steep slopes and in valleys so remote that no road could reach them. The Cascade Range, the Coast Range, the mountains of Vancouver Island, these places received over 100 inches of rain a year. The ground turned to mud for months at a time. Oxen could not work steep hills. They slipped on wet ground and broke their legs in the ruts. They overheated in summer and froze in winter. They ate enormous quantities of hay that had to be hauled in from farms miles away, and feeding a team of 10 oxen through a logging season was an expense that cut straight into profits. And the biggest trees, the ones worth the most money, were often too heavy for any team of animals to move at all. Loggers left them standing or cut them and walked away because there was simply no way to get a 40-ton log off the side of a mountain using muscle power alone. Millions of board feet of timber sat rotting on hillsides across the region, cut and abandoned, because no one had figured out how to move it. John Dolbeer spent years watching this problem grind his company's profits down. He was an inventor by temperament, the kind of man who could not look at a broken process without sketching a fix. He had already patented a circular saw in 1860 and a lumber tallying machine in 1863. But the log-moving problem was the big one. And in August of 1881, standing in the redwood forest near Eureka, he tested a solution that would change the industry permanently. Dolbeer's machine was simple. He took a single-cylinder steam engine, connected it to a horizontally mounted spool called a gypsy head, bolted the whole thing onto a set of log skids, and wrapped 150 feet of 4.5-inch manila rope around the spool. The other end of the rope was attached to a fallen log. When the engineer fired the steam engine, the spool turned, the rope wound tight, and the log came sliding toward the machine across the forest floor. That was it, a steam-powered winch on a sled. He called it a logging engine. Everyone else called it the steam donkey. The name came from sailing ships. On merchant vessels, a donkey engine was the small secondary steam engine used to load cargo, raise heavy sails, and power pumps. Sailors had been using the term for decades. When Dolbeer's invention showed up in the woods doing the same kind of grunt work that shipboard donkey engines did at sea, the name stuck. Dolbeer filed for a patent in 1881 and received patent number 256553 in April of 1882. The first model was crude, but it worked, and that was enough. Operating an early Dolbeer donkey required 3 men, a boy, and a horse. The choker setter was the man who went out into the cut and wrapped the cable around a felled log, securing it with a hook and a short loop of chain called a choker. Once the cable was attached, he stepped clear and signaled to a boy stationed partway between the log and the machine. This boy, usually a teenager, somewhere between 16 and 18 years old, was called the whistle punk. His job was to pull on a thin wire that ran from his position all the way back to a steam whistle mounted on the donkey engine. When the choker setter gave him the signal, the whistle punk yanked the wire. The whistle blew. That told the engineer, the man sitting at the controls of the steam engine, that the log was ready. The engineer was called the donkey puncher. He ran the throttle, watched the steam pressure, and controlled the spool. When the whistle blew, he opened the throttle and the spool began to turn, winding the rope tight and dragging the log toward the machine. A fourth man, the spool tender, stood next to the drum and guided the coiling line with a short stick to keep it from tangling. And when the log arrived at the machine, it was unhitched, and a horse hauled the now slack rope back out into the forest for the choker setter to attach to the next tree. This whole cycle, from hook to haul to reset, took only a few minutes. The same job with Oxen had taken the better part of an hour. The whistle signal system became its own coded language. 1 short blast meant stop. 2 short blasts meant come back on the haulback line. 3 short blasts meant come ahead easy on the main line. 2 long blasts meant bring water. 6 long blasts meant a man was hurt, and to bring the locomotive and a stretcher. Every man on the crew knew the code by heart because their lives depended on it. The whistle punk could not see the donkey puncher, and the donkey puncher could not see the choker setter. The whole system ran on sound alone. A chain of trust stretched across hundreds of feet of forest where enormous logs were moving under thousands of pounds of cable tension. A wrong signal could kill someone. A missed signal could send a 20-ton log rolling over the choker setter before he had time to jump clear. And the whistle punk, the kid at the bottom of the pecking order, was the link that held it all together. One old logger from the Siaslaw country in Oregon recalled that the hook tender would shout instructions. The whistle punk would relay them by clicking a wire connected to the donkey, and the donkey would send back a series of toots to confirm. Go, stop, fast, slow, tighten the line, bring the logs in. An entire vocabulary built from steam and wire. What came next is the part that still does not get enough attention. Cable logging was dangerous in ways that are hard to overstate. The ropes and later the steel cables on these machines were under enormous tension. A frayed cable could snap without warning, and when it did, the broken end whipped through the air fast enough to cut a man in half. A donkey puncher who pulled the throttle too soon could roll the log over the choker setter before he cleared the path. A spool tender who let his attention wander could lose a hand to the spinning drum. One early account describes a spool tender who tried to guide the line with his foot instead of a stick. When he came back from the hospital, he used his new wooden leg instead. And then there was fire. Steam donkeys burned wood to heat their boilers. Wood gives off sparks. The forests of the Pacific Northwest in late summer are full of dry duff and dead branches and resin-soaked bark, and all of it burns fast. The friction of dragging logs across the ground generated its own heat, and it was common to see logs smoking when they arrived at the landing. Loggers kept shovels and pickaxes nearby to smother small fires when they broke out. Most of the time, they managed it. But the steam donkey era also produced some of the worst forest fires in American history. Logging operations depended on steam, and steam depended on fire. Every donkey had a firebox that burned wood or, later, fuel oil, and the boilers operated under pressures of 160 to 180 pounds per square inch. On hot, dry summer days, the combination of open flame, flying sparks, and friction heat from dragging logs turned the forest floor into a tinderbox. In 1902, the Yakult burn tore through Washington state, killing 38 people and destroying 500,000 acres of old-growth timber. The fire moved so fast that people were chased down and killed by the advancing flames. Portland, more than 30 miles away, was dusted with a half-inch layer of ash and soot. That fire, and a subsequent blow-up in Idaho and Montana in 1910, led to the creation of fire lookout towers across the region. But the donkeys kept running. 3 decades later, the connection between steam donkeys and catastrophic fire played out again in Oregon. On August 14, 1933, a logging crew was running a steam donkey operation on the slopes above the North Fork of Gales Creek, west of the town of Forest Grove. The temperature hit 104 degrees. The humidity dropped to around 20%. The crew was using a steam-powered dragline to yard logs to a landing, and the friction of the dragging was generating enough heat to set the logs themselves smoking. They kept working anyway, smothering the small fires as they flared. It was a gamble, and around 1 in the afternoon, they lost. Hot embers from the donkey's firebox escaped and ignited nearby brush, or possibly the heat from a dragged log lit a snag on fire. Within hours, the blaze was out of control. The smoke column rose 8 miles into the sky. Ashes fell in the streets of Tillamook. Charred needles and debris reached ships 500 miles out at sea. By the time seasonal rains finally put the fire out on September 5th, 350,000 acres of old-growth forest had burned. Civilian Conservation Corps crews and hundreds of volunteers fought the blaze with shovels and axes, digging fire lines by hand in terrain so steep they crossed log bridges and climbed rock faces just to reach the fire front. One CCC member was the only known human casualty. The loss in lumber was estimated at more than $400 million in 1933 money, a staggering number at the height of the Great Depression. Private landowners who had owned the burned acreage simply stopped paying their property taxes and forfeited the land to the county because the timber was gone and the ground was worthless. That fire became known as the Tillamook Burn, and it was only the first. 3 more major fires struck the same area at roughly 6-year intervals through 1951, burning a combined total that made it one of the worst forest disasters in American history. And yet, for all of that destruction, the steam donkey also did something remarkable. It opened terrain that had been completely inaccessible to logging, and in doing so, it fueled the construction of an entire region. Within a few years of Dolbeer's first test, the design evolved rapidly. Manila rope gave way to steel wire cable, which was stronger and could handle heavier loads over longer distances. Single drum machines gave way to double drum and triple drum configurations, with separate spools for the main hauling line and a haulback line that returned the cable to the woods without needing a horse at all. The machines got bigger. Some weighed several tons and sat on paired log skids. dragging themselves from one setting to the next by attaching their own cable to a stump or standing tree and winching forward under their own power. The larger ones had a donkey house built on the sled to shelter the crew from rain and cold, plus a water tank for the boiler and sometimes a fuel oil tank mounted on the back. The biggest leap came with high lead logging, and it turned the steam donkey from a useful machine into the engine of an entire industry. In the early days, donkeys dragged logs along the ground. This worked on relatively flat terrain, but bogged down on steep slopes where the logs caught on stumps, rocks, and underbrush, and buried themselves in mud. The solution was to get the cable up off the ground. High lead logging did this by running the main hauling cable up through a heavy iron block mounted at the top of a tall standing tree, sometimes 150 or 200 feet above the forest floor. Finding and preparing that tree was a job for the high climber, and it was one of the most dangerous occupations in the history of American labor. The high climber selected a spar tree based on its height, its straightness, and especially its strength. It had to be free of rot because it was about to bear the weight of tons of cable and swinging logs. Once selected, the climber strapped on leg spikes and a thick rope belt and started up the trunk. He carried an axe and a saw. On the way up, branch by branch, he chopped off every limb. The branches crashed down around him. At the top, swaying in the wind 150 feet above the ground, he sawed through the trunk and topped the tree. The severed crown would fall away, and the remaining trunk would whip violently back and forth like a massive fishing rod, with the climber hanging on at the very tip. Stories from the old logging camps describe the spar tree swaying in 30-foot arcs, while the high climber clung to his rope belt and waited for the motion to stop. Once the tree was topped and rigged with heavy guy wires for stability, blocks and pulleys were attached near the summit, and the donkey's cables were threaded through them. Now, when the donkey hauled on the main line, the log was lifted partially off the ground, swinging toward the spar tree with one end in the air, instead of plowing through the dirt. This meant faster yarding, less damage to the remaining forest floor, and the ability to pull logs uphill and over obstacles that would have stopped a ground lead system cold. Skyline Systems took this even further, suspending a fixed cable between two anchor points with a traveling carriage that could lift logs completely clear of the ground and fly them across valleys and ravines. These systems used spans of up to 2,000 feet and could access terrain so steep that no man or animal could work it safely on foot. The steam donkey sat at the heart of all of it, turning drums, winding cable, and pulling weight that no team of oxen could have budged. By the early 1900s, steam donkeys were everywhere in the timber country of the Pacific Northwest. Oregon, Washington, and British Columbia ran on them. Every major lumber company operated dozens. Brands like Willamette, Washington, Tacoma, and Skagit competed to build bigger, heavier machines with more pulling capacity. The Puget Sound Iron and Steel Works manufactured wide-face yarders that could handle ground lead, high lead, and loading operations depending on how they were rigged. A single donkey could yard 75,000 board feet of timber in a day, a number that would have taken a team of oxen weeks to match. The machine did not get tired. It did not need hay. It worked in rain and heat and freezing cold, as long as someone kept the firebox fed and the boiler pressure up. The men who ran these machines built a culture around them that was as rough and specific as the work itself. Donkey punchers were the aristocrats of the logging camp, well paid and respected because the entire operation depended on their skill. A good donkey puncher could feel the load through the throttle, knew when to ease off before a cable snapped, and could read the whistle signals in his sleep. He inspected cables, drums, and brakes every morning before the first log moved. If the donkey puncher was bad at his job, men died. It was that simple. Below the donkey puncher sat the hook tender, who ran the rigging crew in the woods and made the call on which logs to hook and in what order. The choker setters and rigging slingers did the heavy, dangerous work of attaching cables to felled timber on steep, unstable ground, dodging rolling logs and snapping branches while tons of wood shifted around them. And at the very bottom, there was the whistle punk, the entry-level job, the rung where teenage boys started before working their way up through years of hard labor. Many of the old-timers who worked the Pacific Northwest woods in the 1930s and 40s started their careers jerking the wire as whistlepunks at 16 or 17 years old. A logging camp in those years was its own isolated world. The crews lived in bunkhouses built near the landing, ate meals at long wooden tables in a cookhouse, and worked 6 days a week in weather that would shut down any modern job site. The larger operations had their own railroads, their own blacksmith shops, even their own company towns with general stores and boarding houses. And at the center of all of it, hissing steam and belching smoke, sat the donkey. The decline came faster than anyone expected. In the 1920s and 30s, gasoline and diesel engines began replacing steam in the woods. Diesel-powered tractors and crawler machines like the Caterpillar could go where donkeys could not, climbing grades and working terrain that would have required elaborate spar tree rigging with a steam setup. They did not need a fireman to tend a boiler or a constant supply of water hauled up from the nearest creek. They started with the turn of a key instead of a 2-hour warm-up to build steam pressure, and they did not throw sparks the way wood-fired steam boilers did, which mattered a great deal after the Tillamook fires made the connection between steam logging and catastrophic forest fire impossible to ignore. Oil-fired boilers helped reduce the spark problem on later donkeys, and when the fireman role was eliminated on those rigs, it cut crew costs too. But by then, diesel was already winning the argument. By the early 1950s, steam had disappeared from the forests entirely. The last commercial steam donkey operations shut down in the years after World War II, replaced by diesel yarders and rubber-tired skidders, and eventually by the helicopter logging systems used in steep terrain today. What happened to the machines themselves is one of the stranger chapters in industrial history. When a steam donkey reached the end of its working life, or when the timber in a particular area was played out, the crew simply walked away and left the machine sitting where it was. These things weighed several tons, sometimes as much as a small locomotive. They sat on log sleds in the middle of remote forests with no roads leading to them. There was no crane big enough to lift them out, and no truck that could reach them. It was cheaper to abandon a worn-out donkey than to organize the impossible logistics of hauling it out, so that is exactly what hundreds of logging companies did across Oregon, Washington, and British Columbia for decades. One family in Oregon finished logging their land around 1952 and simply left their donkey in the woods where it stood. Nobody came back for it. The forests grew back around these machines. Moss covered the boilers. Ferns and salal pushed up through the gaps in the log skids. Hemlock saplings took root in the rusted cable drums. 60 years of Pacific Northwest rain did the rest. The iron turned orange. The wood rotted. The machines sank slowly into the forest floor, becoming part of the terrain they had once stripped bare. Today, hikers in the Pacific Northwest still stumble across steam donkeys deep in the woods, sitting exactly where their crews left them 60, 70, 80 years ago. The Tillamook State Forest, replanted after the Great Burns with 72 million Douglas fir seedlings and a billion seeds dropped from helicopters, has several of them rusting quietly among the second-growth trees. A Tacoma-wide face yarder sits on display along a trail in Oregon, a historical marker explaining what it was and why it mattered. The Campbell River Museum in British Columbia has a 1916 Empire steam donkey restored to working condition, and when they fire it up on special occasions, the whistle can be heard across the whole neighborhood. At Disneyland's California Adventure Park in Anaheim, a restored steam donkey sits on display as a historical curiosity, a reminder of a machine most visitors have never heard of. John Dolbeer himself did not live to see how far his invention would go. He died in San Francisco in 1902 at the age of 75. His personal life had been marked by tragedy. He married late. His wife took her own life after a long illness. His young son died in an accident. His daughter also died by suicide 2 years after John himself passed. The mill that carried his name on the Eureka waterfront kept operating until the 1970s. But Dolbeer, the man, was largely forgotten outside of patent records and logging history books. The street in Eureka, named after him, is one of the few public reminders that he existed. What endures is the machine and what it made possible. The steam donkey was not elegant. It was loud, dirty, dangerous, and responsible for some of the worst environmental destruction the Pacific Northwest has ever seen. It killed men with snapping cables and started fires that burned for weeks. But it also did something that nothing else in the 1880s could do. It took 20-ton logs off mountainsides. In the rain, it opened millions of acres of previously unreachable timber. It built the lumber supply that framed the houses of a growing nation. And it did all of this with a technology so simple that a farm kid from New Hampshire could sketch it on the back of an envelope, a steam engine, a spool, and a rope. The forests grew back. The machines did not come home. And somewhere deep in the mossy woods of the Oregon Coast Range, if you know where to look, you can still find one sitting on its log sled, boiler cold, cables frozen with rust, waiting in the rain, like it has been waiting for the better part of a century. If this story surprised you, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you do not miss the next one. Drop a like and leave a comment telling us which forgotten machine you want to hear about next.